The rancher had buried one son and nearly buried his heart with him. But when he saw the boy at the fence, starving, broken, and somehow familiar, grief cracked open to something deeper: purpose. The boy was nothing but bones and dirt when Thomas Avery first saw him. Arms looped weakly over the top rail of the south fence, head bowed like he might fall asleep right there on his feet with nothing but barbed wire and wind to catch him. The land stretched behind the boy for miles, dry, brittle, unforgiving, offering no hint of where he'd come from or how far he'd wandered. Thomas didn't call out, didn't run. He simply stood in the doorway of the barn, his work gloves hanging from one hand, heart thudding like a war drum beneath his ribs. Because the boy looked exactly like Caleb. Caleb, who'd been dead nearly 3 winters. Caleb, who'd once run through these very fields chasing after cattle with a grin split wide on his face, freckles dancing under the sun. Caleb, whose lungs had failed him that awful October and never caught breath again. But this was Caleb, couldn't be. This child, thin as a reed, coat several sizes too large, hair a wild mess of straw, was barely standing. Still, the resemblance was enough to stop time. Thomas moved. Not fast, not slow, just steady, like he might spook the vision if he rushed. His boots crunched over the gravel path between barn and pasture. The wind tugged at his coat, cold with the bite of morning that hadn't quite burned off. He reached the fence line just as the boy's legs gave out. The child crumpled into the dry grass like a broken thing dropped from heaven. "Hey," Thomas said, voice raw as it clawed up his throat. "Hey now." The boy stirred. Not fully conscious, just a groan, a twitch of fingers, the briefest lift of his chin. His face was sunburned and pale in turns, cheeks hollowed, eyes sunken. Thomas reached the gate, unlatched it, and dropped to his knees in the dust. He'd held Caleb like this once, only then it had been fever, sweat, and fear choking them both. Now it was dust and silence, and a pulse so faint it barely counted. "You hear me, son?" Thomas asked, hands searching the boy's back for injuries. "Can you speak? A whimper, a word maybe, or just breath?" He hoisted the boy into his arms, light, too light, fragile like carrying a glass jar full of sorrow. The boy's arms hung limp, his face pressed against Thomas's chest, and Thomas felt something twist deep inside his ribs. He hadn't carried a child since the day of the funeral. Inside the house, the world narrowed to necessity. Boots off, water on, stove lit. He laid the boy on the couch and found himself muttering prayers he hadn't spoken in years, not since Caleb's cough turned to bleeding and no doctor or preacher could fix what was broken. Now he whispered again, not fancy, not loud, just desperate. The boy didn't wake, not fully, but he drank, sips at first, then more, lips trembling around the rim of the cup. Thomas spooned broth into his mouth, one shake at a time, letting the boy's breathing settle between each swallow. Outside, the wind had stilled. Inside, time hung heavy. It was hours before the boy's eyes fluttered open. He didn't speak right away, just looked around the room like it might vanish if he blinked too hard. His gaze drifted to the mantel, where a dusty photograph of Caleb still stood beside an old Bible and a broken pocket watch. Then the boy looked at Thomas, really looked, and flinched. "You're safe," Thomas said quietly. "Ain't no one gonna hurt you here." The boy didn't relax, but he didn't run either. His eyes were the same color as Caleb's, same shape too, and the way his lower lip trembled before he spoke, it near stopped Thomas's heart. "What's your name?" Thomas asked. The boy's voice was a rasp, barely there. "Jude." Thomas nodded once, let the name settle. "You got people, Jude, folks who know where you are." Jude shook his head, slow, small. Then he pulled the oversized coat tighter around himself and curled his knees up like a stray dog trying to vanish. It wasn't until nightfall that Thomas found the marks. Scars, thin, angry lines up the boy's back, crisscrossed like whip lashes. He found them when Jude shifted in his sleep and the shirt slipped. Thomas froze, breath caught, hands shaking. Who would do that to a child? He didn't sleep that night. Not really. Sat by the fire with a cup of coffee gone cold, listening to the wind scrape against the shutters. Jude slept fitfully, murmured in his dreams, twitched at shadows. Thomas stared at the boy's face and tried not to see Caleb. The next morning brought questions, too many, all unanswered. Where had Jude come from? What had happened to him? Why had he ended up at Thomas's fence? But the bigger question, the one Thomas didn't want to ask, was what he was supposed to do now. Because the boy needed care, food, warmth, safety, and Thomas had none of that to spare. Since his wife passed, the house had gone quiet. Since Caleb died, it had turned to stone. There were no toys left, no laughter, no music, just one man and his ghosts living off a patch of stubborn land too dry for hope. And now this boy. Jude barely spoke, ate when prompted, drank when asked, sat near the window like he expected someone to come for him, or maybe like he hoped no one ever would. Thomas didn't press. He knew what silence could protect. But on the third day, something changed. Thomas was working the north pasture, mending fence line, when he heard the scream. Short, sharp, full of pain. He dropped the wire and ran. Found Jude crouched in the barn, arms wrapped around his head, rocking like the world was ending. One of the horses had kicked the stall wall. A loud bang, nothing more. But to Jude it had sounded like gunfire. Thomas knelt, hands raised. "It's all right, son, just a spook, no harm done." Jude was trembling, eyes wide, and then out of nowhere he spoke. "Don't let him find me." Thomas blinked, "Who?" But Jude didn't answer, just kept whispering the same words again and again. "Don't let him find me, please, don't let him find me." Thomas gathered him up, held him tight, whispered steady words, but inside something new bloomed. This wasn't just a starving boy at a fence. This was something darker, something hunted. And whether he wanted it or not, Thomas Avery had just stepped into the middle of it. He looked down at the child in his arms and felt the old ache swell. Caleb's face flickered there, not in truth but in memory, a ghost dancing behind Jude's frightened eyes. The past wasn't done with him, not yet. And maybe, just maybe, God wasn't done either. Jude didn't talk for the rest of the day. After the barn episode, Thomas kept him close, set him to small tasks around the house, things that didn't require much strength or speech. Sweeping the porch, shelling peas, holding the nails while Thomas fixed a drawer that never sat quite right. The boy moved like a shadow, always a step behind, watching everything with quiet eyes that gave away more than he probably meant to. He never flinched when Thomas raised his voice to call out to the animals, or when he slammed a door shut to keep the wind out. But the moment boots thudded too loud on the floor or a chair scraped sharply against the boards, Jude tensed, like he was bracing for something, like punishment came fast and without warning wherever he came from. That night, as Thomas sat beside the hearth with his Bible open on his lap, he didn't read. The pages blurred into a sea of faded ink and long-past verses. His eyes kept drifting toward the boy curled up in the armchair across the room, bundled in one of Caleb's old blankets, his face half-lit by the fire's flicker. Jude wasn't asleep. His breathing gave that much away. Slow, too measured, he was pretending. Waiting, maybe. Thomas didn't speak. He just sat there, listening to the quiet. It had been years since the house had anyone in it besides Thomas. Years since a second plate had been set on the table or boots other than his sat drying by the fire. There was a strange comfort in the sound of Jude's breathing, even when it was strained and nervous. A reminder that the world hadn't ended, not completely, even if it had felt like it. Thomas finally shut the Bible and stood. Jude's eyes snapped open, alert. "Time for bed," Thomas said simply. "You can take the cot in Caleb's room." Jude looked at him like he didn't understand. "It's just a room," Thomas added, realizing how strange that might have sounded to someone who didn't know Caleb. "Got a good window, warm enough long as the stove keeps going." Still, Jude didn't move. Thomas didn't push. He simply turned, walked down the hallway, and opened the door to the bedroom that had gone untouched since the funeral. Dust had settled on the desk. The quilt was still folded at the foot of the bed just as his wife had left it. A small wooden horse Caleb carved sat on the windowsill, faded now by sun. He lit the lamp, turned down the covers, and waited. After a few minutes, soft footsteps approached. Jude stopped in the doorway, clutching the blanket like a shield. "I'll be just down the hall," Thomas said, stepping aside. Jude entered the room slowly, reverently. He ran his fingers over the edge of the bed frame, then looked at the shelf where a pair of worn boots still rested. "Was this your boy S?" he asked quietly. Thomas swallowed. "Yeah." Jude nodded like that explained everything. He didn't ask what happened, didn't press. Just climbed into the bed and lay down, stiff as a board, hands folded over his chest. Thomas turned the lamp down low and left the door ajar. That night the wind picked up again. The shutters rattled and a branch scraped the roof like fingernails. But Thomas slept lighter than he had in years. Not better, exactly, just aware. Like some part of him had been stirred awake after too long buried. At dawn, the rooster's call broke the quiet. Thomas rose, stretched, and made his way to the kitchen. He didn't expect to find Jude already awake, sitting at the table with a cup of water in his hands. The boy looked like he hadn't slept. "Did the bed not suit you?" Thomas asked, pouring coffee. "It's fine," Jude said, "just not used to doors." Thomas sipped his coffee and said nothing. They ate in silence, the way men do when the words ain't ready to come yet. Thomas noticed how Jude only took half portions, how he left food on the plate like he was used to making it stretch. Later that morning, they hitched the mule and rode into town. Jude didn't ask why, just climbed into the wagon and sat quietly as they made the slow journey into Cold Hollow, a spit of a place with one general store, one church, and a barber shop that hadn't cut hair since before the last snowfall. Thomas hadn't been into town in months, not since spring when he came in for salt, nails, and tobacco. The townsfolk didn't bother him much anymore. They offered comfort after Caleb passed, brought pies and prayers, and tried to fill the silence with too many words. But grief has its own clock, and Thomas never liked being watched while he mourned. When they rolled into the square, heads turned, not at Thomas, at the boy. A child with no family don't just appear on a ranch miles out of town. They stopped at the store first. Thomas picked up flour, oats, lye soap, and a new tin of coffee. Jude trailed behind, quiet but observant. The storekeeper, Henry Pike, raised an eyebrow. "Got yourself a helper, Tom?" "Found him near the fence," Thomas said simply, "half-starved." Henry nodded slowly. "You take him in." "For now." Henry wrapped the goods without another word, but his eyes lingered on Jude's face like he was trying to place him. Next was the church. Not for prayer. Thomas still hadn't figured out what to say to God after losing Caleb, but for a quiet word with Pastor Emmett. They stood near the back pew, out of earshot. "He's been hurt," Thomas said low. "Scars on his back, spooked by noises, won't say where he's from." Emmett's face darkened. "Runaway." "Maybe, or worse." "You think someone's looking for him?" "I think someone will." Emmett folded his hands. "If he needs shelter." "He's staying with me." The pastor nodded. "You sure, Tom?" Thomas looked across the room where Jude sat on a pew, staring at the stained glass window with a look too heavy for someone so small. "No," Thomas said, "but I will be." They left town by noon and the road back felt heavier. Thomas kept scanning the horizon. Something about the way people had stared, the whispers behind hands, it put him on edge. When they crested the last hill before the ranch, Jude finally spoke. "Why are you helping me?" Thomas didn't answer right away. Let the question sit. Then finally, "You remind me of someone." Jude didn't press, just nodded like he understood more than Thomas had said. That night, as the stars blinked alive over the pasture, Jude helped bring in the last of the wood. He worked slow, careful, like someone who didn't want to do it wrong. Thomas watched him from the porch. Something had settled in his chest, a knowing. This boy wasn't just a lost soul, he was carrying something. A story, a past, maybe even a warning. Later, as Thomas cleaned up after supper, he found a piece of paper folded beneath the plate Jude had used. It was torn at the edges, stained with something dark, and only had 2 lines written in a shaky scrawl. "He's still looking. If I'm found, run." Thomas stared at it, the words etching into his brain like fire on dry wood. Someone was after this child. And now, by keeping him, Thomas had stepped into that storm willingly. He folded the note, tucked it into his coat pocket, and turned toward the hallway where Jude had already vanished into Caleb's room. The door stood open, the lamp inside glowed soft. Thomas walked back to the hearth, sat down, and stared at the fire long after it had burned low. The next day began with silence, but it wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the kind that clung to the walls, that settled in the bones like cold. Thomas had known that kind of quiet once before, the morning after Caleb died, when even the birds refused to sing. And now, once again, something sat wrong in the air. Jude was still in bed when Thomas stepped outside to check the fence line. The morning sky had a strange haze to it, the sun pale and unsure as it pushed through a thin veil of clouds. The horses moved nervously in the pasture, skittish for no reason Thomas could see. He noticed tracks in the dirt near the gate, not from an animal, boots. He bent down, brushing a palm over the impression. 1, maybe 2 sets, not from last night, fresh, as in while they slept. Thomas stood and scanned the tree line. No movement, nothing out of place, but that kind of nothing felt louder than a scream. Back inside, Jude was dressed and sitting at the table, chewing a piece of bread in small bites like he expected it to be taken from him at any moment. Thomas said nothing about the tracks. Not yet. "You sleep all right?" he asked instead. Jude nodded, but the way his fingers clenched around the crust gave him away. "You see anything strange last night?" Jude froze, then very slowly he nodded again. "What was it?" Someone was by the window." Thomas's stomach sank. "You sure?" Jude's voice was small but certain. "I saw the shadow. It stayed a long time." Thomas didn't let the fear show on his face. He didn't want to scare the boy more than he already was. But his mind was moving fast now, running through options, paths, choices. Someone had come, watched, left. Or maybe they hadn't left at all. He stood, poured 2 cups of coffee, 1 real, 1 hot water with a splash of cream for Jude, and sat at the table. "I found boot prints outside," he said. "Fresh. Whoever it was, they didn't knock." Jude's hands tightened around the cup. "I need to know the truth now," Thomas said gently. "Who's looking for you?" The boy hesitated, then looked up, his eyes wide and haunted. "My uncle." Thomas waited. "He took me after my mama died, said he was kin, said he'd take care of me, but he lied." Jude's voice cracked. "He made me work, beat me if I didn't, said if I ran, no one believed me, said the land was too wide, that I'd never get far." Thomas swallowed hard. "But you ran anyway." Jude nodded, "Took food from the smokehouse, walked at night, hid during the day. I didn't mean to end up here, I was just going anywhere." "You didn't end up here by accident," Thomas said, his voice low. "You were meant to come. Fence lines stretch for miles in this valley. You came to mine." Jude looked down. "I didn't know who lived here." "Didn't matter," Thomas said. "You still came." For a while they just sat there. The fire crackled. A draft crept under the door. Outside, the wind kicked up dust like whispers rising from the earth. By mid-afternoon, Thomas had his rifle out. Not in panic, in preparation. He checked the sights, oiled the bolt, and loaded a few rounds. He wasn't eager for violence, had seen more of it in his younger days than he liked to admit, but he also wasn't a man who stood still when wolves circled his land. Jude watched him from the doorway. "Are you gonna make me leave?" Thomas looked up. "No, but I might have to make someone else leave." The next 2 days passed in uneasy quiet. Thomas kept Jude close, even when working the fields or checking the water troughs. He taught him how to carry wood without wasting steps, how to start the stove with a single match, how to listen for changes in the wind. Small lessons that filled the space between them. But at night the unease returned. More tracks, another shadow by the shed. Then came the note. Pinned to the barn door with a hunting knife. No name, no signature, just 5 words scrawled in black ink. "You got what's mine, Avery." Thomas ripped it down, heart pounding. His name, not the boy's, his. That night he didn't sleep. He moved Caleb's cot into the master bedroom, kept Jude close, sat in the rocking chair with his rifle across his lap, eyes never leaving the window. Every creak of the house made him tense. Every gust of wind was a threat. Jude tried to stay awake, but exhaustion took him. Even asleep he twitched, mumbled. Once he cried out and clutched at the blanket like it might disappear. And Thomas just sat there, listening to the echoes of a pain he couldn't erase. Morning brought more than frost. Tracks again, only this time closer, all the way to the porch. And behind the barn, a rabbit hung from the fence by its hind legs, throat slit, blood staining the wood beneath it. A message. Jude saw it, said nothing, just stared, then turned and walked inside. Thomas followed him in, found him in the corner of the kitchen, arms wrapped tight around his knees. "He's here," Jude whispered. Thomas crouched beside him, then he made a mistake. Jude looked up. "What if he won't leave? What if he hurts you too?" Thomas felt something deep in his chest harden. Not anger, not yet, but resolve. He'd lost one child already. He wouldn't lose another. That evening Thomas prepared. He stacked wood near the door, checked every window, reinforced the latches, cleaned the rifle again and laid the pistol on the mantel just in case. Then he sat with Jude by the fire, both of them watching the flames as darkness gathered outside. "Caleb was 10, Thomas said suddenly, his voice low. Had a laugh that could chase off storms, got sick one fall, at first just a cough. Then the fever came. Doctor did what he could, but it wasn't enough." Jude didn't speak, just listened. "When he passed," Thomas continued, "something in me shut off, like the world stopped spinning but forgot to tell the sky." He looked at the boy beside him. "You remind me of him, not just in the face, in the way you hold yourself, like you're waiting for the world to crack open under you." Jude's lip trembled. "I don't want to be him." "You're not," Thomas said. "You're you, and you're alive. That counts for something." They sat there a while longer, the quiet between them no longer heavy but shared. Until a knock came at the door. 3 short raps, sharp, measured. Thomas rose slowly. Jude froze. The knock came again. Thomas reached for the rifle. "Stay here," he whispered, "no matter what." He moved to the door, took a breath, then opened it. A man stood there, mid-40s, maybe older, broad shoulders under a long coat, hat pulled low. His face was lined, mouth set in a sneer that came easy. Behind him, 2 others flanked the path. One held a shotgun. The other leaned against the post with a knife spinning lazy between his fingers. The man in the center tipped his hat. "Even in, Thomas Avery, I reckon." Thomas didn't answer. "You got a boy under your roof don't belong to you," the man continued. "Name S. Jude, my kin." "He says different." The man smiled without warmth. "Boy's confused or lying. Either way, he's common with us." "No," Thomas said steady. "You sure you want to make this hard?" the man asked, tilting his head. "We're not unreasonable, just want what's ours." "He's not yours." Silence stretched. Then the man's voice turned cold. "Last chance. Thomas stepped back. You put a knife in my barn. You pinned a note to my door. You strung up a rabbit like some kind of warning. That was your chance. He raised the rifle. This is mine. The standoff lasted seconds, but it felt like hours. The man's lip curled. He spat into the dirt, then turned. Let's go, he barked. The others hesitated, but followed. They disappeared into the night. Thomas shut the door and locked it tight. Jude came out of hiding, pale but standing. You didn't give me up, he whispered. Thomas knelt, looked him in the eyes. You're not a burden, you're a boy, and no one is taking you from this place. Jude trembled. They'll come back. I know, Thomas said, but so will morning. And this time they'd be ready. Dawn broke slow the next morning, creeping over the land with a sickly light that barely pushed the darkness away. The frost clung heavy to the window panes, and smoke curled from the chimney as Thomas stirred the embers in the stove back to life. Inside, the house was quiet, not the strained quiet from days past, but something thicker now. Tension layered over routine. Even the creak of the floorboards seemed louder than it should have been. Jude hadn't spoken much after the men left. He'd sat near the fire with wide eyes, legs drawn up beneath Caleb's blanket, unmoving except to breathe. Thomas didn't push him. He knew trauma made its own time. He'd learned that after the funeral, when the neighbors tried to offer comfort too soon, when prayers sounded more like echoes bouncing around an empty house than anything holy. Some wounds weren't meant to be wrapped in words. Some were just meant to be waited out. But he also knew they had little time to wait now. Whoever that man was, Jude's uncle, he wasn't gone for good. He walked away without a fight, not because he feared Thomas, but because men like that preferred control. They circled first, tested the fence, then struck where the wood was weakest. And Thomas wasn't going to give him that chance. The coffee brewed slowly, scent filling the kitchen. Thomas poured a cup, took a long drink, then set it down and started pulling supplies. Nails, wire, boards, tools. He moved fast, methodical, reinforcing doors, checking shutters, adding a second latch to the back window. The old place had never been built for defense. It was just a ranch house meant to weather storms and winter, but it could be made to hold. Midway through securing the kitchen doorframe, he heard soft footsteps behind him. Jude stood there barefoot, arms crossed over his chest, hair sticking up at wild angles. His eyes were clearer today, but still cautious. You fixing everything? The boy asked. Trying to, Thomas said without turning. Figured if someone's coming again, they might as well earn it. Jude stepped closer, watching. I can help, he said after a moment. Thomas looked at him. You sure? Jude nodded. You took me in, I don't want to just hide. Thomas studied him for a beat longer, then passed him a handful of nails. All right then, let's work. And so they did, all morning, hammering boards, moving furniture against weak points in the walls, stacking wood inside instead of on the porch. Jude proved quicker than expected, focused, his small hands steady even when holding the ladder or fitting a board into place. He didn't talk much, but the silence between them was different now. Not fear, not hesitation, just a shared understanding. By noon, the house had been reshaped, not into a fortress exactly, but a refuge fortified by more than just wood and nails. It had heart again, a reason to hold the line. Outside, the sky had turned dark with clouds. Snow threatened, but hadn't yet come. The wind carried a sharpness that whispered of bad things coming from the west. Thomas walked the edge of the property line, rifle slung over his shoulder, eyes scanning the horizon. He stopped near the fence where Jude had first appeared. The barbed wire sagged in one spot, a small footprint still pressed into the dirt below, a reminder of how this all began. He turned and saw Jude standing behind him. You think they'll come tonight? Jude asked quietly. I'd bet on it. Jude's mouth worked around a thought before he said it. I'm scared. Thomas nodded. So am I. That seemed to surprise the boy. Thing about fear, Thomas added, is that it don't mean you run, just means you care about what's behind you, and right now what's behind me is you. That enough for you to stand? Jude nodded slowly. Yeah. They went back inside, prepared more, loaded the fire, laid out spare clothes, readied a small satchel in case they had to run, but neither of them really planned to use it, not this time. As night approached, Thomas handed Jude a wooden object wrapped in cloth. The boy opened it carefully. Inside was a small slingshot, carved from an old branch and smoothed with age. Caleb made it when he was your age, Thomas said. Never hit much with it, but always kept it close. Jude turned it in his hands. You sure? Thomas nodded. Figure it ought to be used by someone with something to protect. They ate a quiet dinner, beans and cornbread. Simple, filling, the kind of meal you eat when you're waiting for the night to speak its piece. Then they waited. And the night answered. It was just after midnight when the dog barked. Not a panicked bark, not warning, just a soft sound like it wasn't sure yet what it heard. Thomas rose, rifle already in hand. He checked the window. Nothing. Then he heard it, a metallic clang near the barn, then silence. Then another sound, softer this time, wood creaking, a door maybe. He moved toward the back, motioned for Jude to stay low. The barn had two entrances, one through the front wide and open, the other a small side door easy to overlook. Thomas slipped through the kitchen, out the back and into the cold. He moved slow, steps quiet, the rifle cold against his hands. The wind had died completely. No sound now but the beat of his own heart and the faint groan of wood under pressure. He reached the barn, pressed his back to the wall. Then waited. A shadow passed across the front door. Thomas held his breath. The door creaked open. One man, alone, holding a lantern, not the uncle from before, taller, thinner, looked more like a hired hand than blood. Thomas waited until he stepped inside, then moved fast, slammed the door shut behind him, wedged the beam across the latch and backed off into the darkness. Inside, the man cursed and banged against the wood. Thomas ran. Back to the house, back to Jude. But he was too late. The front door was open. And Jude was gone. Thomas's blood went cold. He shouted the boy's name, ran through the house out to the porch. Then he saw it, tracks in the dirt, two sets, one small, one large, leading west toward the ridge. He grabbed his coat, rifle, and the lantern and followed. The path curved through the trees, winding fast. Whoever had taken the boy knew the land, or didn't care what it did to his ankles. Thomas moved like a man possessed. Half a mile out he found Jude's boot, caught on a root, torn from his foot in the struggle. Another 100 yards and he saw them. The uncle again, holding Jude by the collar, dragging him like a sack of grain. The boy kicked weakly, fought back with everything he had left. Thomas raised the rifle. Let him go. The uncle froze, then turned. Well, well, he said, dragging Jude in front of him like a shield. Was wonderin' when you'd come. Thought you might send that boy out with a note instead. You're bolder than I pegged you. I'll say it one more time, Thomas growled. Let him go. Why? The man sneered. He's mine, my brother's son, blood don't lie. He's not a thing to be owned. He's a runaway, a thief. You think he found his way to your ranch by accident. I think he ran because you made his life a prison. The uncle smiled, then pulled a pistol from his coat and pressed it to Jude's head. Then maybe I just end this mess right now. Boy's more trouble than he's worth. Thomas didn't think, didn't weigh odds. He squeezed the trigger. The shot rang through the trees like thunder. The uncle staggered, dropped the pistol. The bullet had caught his shoulder, enough to spin him but not kill him. Jude dropped to the ground and rolled free. Thomas ran forward, tackled the man before he could recover, knocked the weapon from his reach, and drove the butt of the rifle into his ribs. The man gasped and coughed blood into the dirt. "You touch him again," Thomas growled, "and I'll finish what I started." He stood, pulled Jude into his arms. The boy clung to him, sobbing. "I'm sorry," Jude whispered. "I didn't mean," he said, "he'd kill you." Thomas held him tighter. "It's over now. He's not gonna hurt anyone." Behind them, the uncle moaned and tried to crawl away. Thomas let him go, he said, "but if I ever see you again, you won't walk out next time." He carried Jude back through the trees, step by step, lantern swinging, heart pounding. By the time they reached the house, dawn was just beginning to bleed across the hills. He set Jude down gently on the couch, fetched water, and wiped the blood from the boy's cheek. "You're safe," he said again. Jude didn't answer, just leaned into him, exhausted. Thomas sat back, let the fire warm his bones, and closed his eyes. Outside, the day had started fresh. But inside, something had changed. The boy wasn't just under his protection now. He was under his care. And Thomas knew, deep in the place where grief used to live, that he wasn't letting him go. The sun rose slow, pushing a thin gold sheen across the frostbitten hills. The house smelled of smoke, iron, and boiled coffee, but beneath it all lingered something newer, something that hadn't been there in years: life. Not just survival, but something with shape and motion. A heartbeat. Jude slept late into the morning. After what happened, Thomas let him. The boy was bruised, scraped, but in one piece. He'd cried until sleep claimed him, curled tight on the old couch beneath Caleb's blanket. Thomas sat nearby through the night, boots off, rifle within reach, hat in his lap. The uncle's pistol now lay locked in the drawer beneath the sink. Useless and quiet, a souvenir of evil that wouldn't be allowed to resurface. Thomas kept the fire going, checked the windows, cleaned the blood off the porch where Jude had dropped his boot, and then stepped out into the morning mist. He breathed deep, letting the cold burn through the tightness in his lungs. Every breath felt earned. Every step forward now felt heavier, like he was walking not just for himself anymore. When Jude finally stirred, Thomas was back in the kitchen boiling oats and cutting dried apples into small pieces. The boy looked smaller than ever, sitting up slow, blinking against the morning light. His eyes tracked the corners of the room like he wasn't sure it would still be here. "You're all right," Thomas said gently. "You're home." Jude opened his mouth like he might argue, but nothing came, just a nod. That was enough. The day passed in a kind of quiet rebuilding. Thomas didn't speak of the night before. Jude didn't ask. Some things didn't need rehashing when the bruises were still blooming. They worked together again, fixed the shed's busted door, cleaned out the chicken coop, hauled water for the trough. Life didn't stop just because pain lingered. That was the rhythm of the land. Hurt, heal, keep moving. By evening, Jude was laughing. Not loud, not constant, just soft chuckles under his breath when the youngest hen pecked at Thomas's bootlaces, or when the mule made its wheezing bray at the wrong time and scared a squirrel out of the woodpile. Thomas caught himself smiling too, not because it was forced, but because it was true. At supper they sat across from each other in the dim lamplight. Jude ate slow but hearty. Thomas passed the butter without being asked, and then Jude set his fork down. "Why did you do it?" he asked quietly. Thomas looked up. "Do what?" "Stand up to him. You didn't know me. I could have been anyone. You could have just let him take me." Thomas wiped his mouth and leaned back in his chair. He stared at the ceiling for a moment, listening to the wind scratch softly against the shingles. "Because he looked at you like you were a problem," Thomas said finally. "And I've buried too many good people who were treated like problems." Jude's lip trembled. "You think I'm good?" "I think you're better than most grown men I've met. I think you've been through hell and you didn't let it turn you mean. That says something." Jude didn't speak again, but he smiled, just barely. The kind of smile that belonged to someone who was finally starting to believe they deserved to. Later, after the dishes were done and the fire was down to coals, Thomas walked to the back room where Caleb's things were still stored. He opened the cedar chest. Inside lay the remains of a boyhood, a frayed rope belt, a slingshot with a cracked handle, a notebook full of half-finished drawings, and a shirt, blue with pearl buttons, just barely too big for Jude. He held it for a moment, fingers resting against the fabric. Then he folded it under his arm and brought it back to the living room. Jude was nodding off in the chair. Thomas tapped his shoulder, thought this might fit. Jude blinked awake, looked at the shirt, took it with both hands. It was his. Thomas nodded, yeah. Jude looked down. I don't want to take his place. You're not, Thomas said. You've got your own. That night Jude slept in the bedroom. Not Caleb's old cot, but the main bed. Thomas took the chair by the fire again, not because he had to, but because it felt right. Because Jude needed to know the world would stay standing if he closed his eyes. And it did. For a while peace returned. A week passed, then another. The bruises faded, the bags under Jude's eyes eased. He began whistling while doing chores, started asking questions, curious ones, not fearful, about the ranch, about Thomas, about the stars and the birds and how fences held things together. Thomas answered them all. In those quiet days something grew between them, not spoken, not labeled, but strong. The townsfolk began to notice too. When Thomas returned to Cold Hollow for feed and flour, Jude went with him. Folks tipped hats, offered guarded smiles. Henry Pike, the storekeeper, gave Jude a peppermint stick without asking for a penny. Pastor Emmett shook the boy's hand. "You're looking stronger, son," he said with a nod. "Thanks to him," Jude replied, glancing at Thomas. The church bell rang steady that Sunday. Thomas sat in the back pew. Jude sat beside him. They didn't sing, but they listened. And for the first time in a long while, Thomas heard the message instead of the pain. Afterward, Pastor Emmett pulled Thomas aside. "You've changed," he said plainly. Thomas shrugged, no choice in it. "There's always a choice," Emmett replied. "You just finally saw yours." That night Thomas brought out a tin box from the top shelf of the closet. Inside were papers, old deeds, marriage records, and Caleb's death certificate. At the bottom was a blank form, a guardianship application. He didn't say anything to Jude at first, just set the paper on the table and started filling it out. Jude came over, read the top line, and froze. "You want to be my..." Thomas kept writing. "I don't want you to feel like you're just passing through. This place is yours now, if you want it." Jude sat down hard. His hands shook, his eyes filled. "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything, just sign here." And so he did. Jude Avery. New name, same soul, but rooted now, chosen. That night they didn't sleep early. They sat up talking about small things, stories, memories. Jude shared about his mother, about how she used to sing to him before bed, how she had hands that never hurt and eyes that smiled even when she was tired. Thomas shared about Caleb, about the time he tried to ride a calf and ended up face first in the trough, about how he hated pickles but ate them anyway to make his mother proud. Two souls mending in the light of shared loss. The days that followed were slow healing. The fence line held, the snow melted, the creek swelled. Then came the letter. It arrived folded into thirds, sealed with a smear of wax, carried by a writer Thomas didn't recognize. No return address. No signature. Just a name on the outside, Thomas Avery. Thomas opened it with a knife and read it by the fire. "You should have finished it. He's got brothers. And they ain't as patient." Thomas folded it, sat back and closed his eyes. He'd hoped they were done. He'd been wrong. The next morning, he began teaching Jude how to shoot. Not because he wanted to, because he had to. They stood behind the barn, tin cans lined on a post. Thomas showed him how to hold the rifle, how to breathe. Jude hit the third can on his sixth try. That was luck, he said. Maybe, Thomas replied, but luck loves the prepared. They trained every day after that, shooting, running, climbing, not in fear, in preparation. Jude grew stronger, more sure, but his eyes still searched the horizon more than they should have. And then one night, the dog barked again. Low, steady. Thomas stepped onto the porch and saw the line of torches at the edge of the ridge. 5 riders. Motionless. Waiting. He closed the door, locked it. Turned to Jude. It's starting again, he said. Jude didn't flinch. Then let's finish it. They didn't come that night. The riders stayed on the ridge until well past midnight, torches like watchful eyes against the black sky, then turned and vanished into the trees one by one, leaving the valley soaked in silence. Thomas didn't sleep. Jude didn't either. They sat by the fire, boots on, rifles leaning close, watching the windows like men expecting the storm to break any minute. But morning came, pale and quiet, and nothing stirred except the crows circling above the far pasture. Jude asked no questions when he saw the torches were gone. Just walked to the table, poured a tin of water, and stared out the window while he drank. Thomas stepped beside him. They're testing us, seeing how we react, like coyotes circling a calf. Jude's hand clenched the cup. I don't want to run. You won't. But you're scared. I'm responsible, Thomas said quietly. That's different. Outside, the ranch looked the same as it had the day before. Muddy ground thawing slow, snow patches dissolving under the sun, fence lines stretching steady like bones under the skin of the earth. But everything felt more brittle now, like even the wood in the porch rails could hear the footsteps coming. Thomas didn't pretend he wasn't worried. 5 riders didn't come to negotiate. They came to remind him that what he'd done, taking in Jude, standing against blood, firing a bullet into a man's shoulder, carried a weight. And blood always tried to collect its due. By midday, Thomas had the wagon hitched, not to run, but to move supplies closer to the house: water, grain, rope, 2 sacks of flour. He loaded them into the cellar, reinforced the trapdoor, and added a second bolt to the inside. He didn't plan to hide there, but if it came to it, he wanted a fallback. He wanted Jude to have a place the fire wouldn't reach. Jude helped silently, hauling smaller bundles, stacking kindling, sharpening knives with slow, practiced strokes. The boy moved with purpose now, no longer a shadow, no longer afraid of his own steps. Thomas watched him carefully. Every day, the fear inside Jude twisted itself into something new, not quite anger, not yet confidence, but a firm understanding that he didn't want to be prey ever again. At supper, the wind picked up. It came from the west, where the ridge stood, thick with pine and dark intentions. The smell of smoke reached them first, not from their own chimney, from somewhere deeper, farther, burning pine and dry grass, controlled maybe, or a signal. They ate quickly: salt pork, bread, apples sliced thin and laid out with cinnamon, a meal for energy, not for comfort. Thomas kept checking the windows. Then came the knock. Not the door this time. The side wall. 3 soft taps, deliberate. Jude froze mid-bite. Thomas stood slowly, rifle in hand. He moved to the edge of the kitchen, pressed his back to the wall, and whispered, "Stay low. No noise." Jude obeyed. Thomas waited. Another knock, this time louder, a knuckle against the window frame. He stepped forward, pulled the curtain just an inch. A man stood outside, alone, young, maybe 20, no gun drawn, no hat, hands up. Thomas opened the window a sliver. "Speak." "Name's Rafe," the man said. "I ain't here to fight, they don't know I came." Thomas narrowed his eyes. "Who's they?" "The ones that were on the ridge, the others. I rode with them till last night." Jude stood now slowly behind Thomas. The name Rafe clearly meant something. He didn't speak, but his posture changed, rigid, alert. "You were with his uncle," Thomas said flatly. Rafe nodded. Didn't know what it was. Thought we were just picking up a runaway, said he stole money, that he hurt someone. And you just believed it. Rafe lowered his gaze. At first, but after last night, they ain't talking about justice. They're talking about burning this place to the ground. Thomas stepped back from the window. Come in, slowly. Rafe entered with hands raised, eyes flicking toward Jude. I remember you, the boy said, voice steady. You gave me water that first night. Rafe nodded. Didn't think he'd chase you this far, thought maybe you made it out. Thomas closed the door behind them. How many are there? 5 now. One got thrown off his horse yesterday, broke his leg. He won't ride for a while. They're camped near the river bend, waiting on someone. Who? Don't know, but they're saying things like final reckoning. They're angry, not just about the boy, about you. You made em look weak. Thomas glanced at Jude. Then we'll be ready. Rafe shifted uneasily. I don't want part of it anymore. I just wanted a warm place. I didn't know he was gonna hurt a kid. Thomas studied him, weighed the words, then gave a slow nod. You stay here tonight. Tomorrow you ride east. Tell anyone that'll listen what they're planning. Rafe's eyes widened. You trust me? No, but I trust Jude. He said you gave him water. That night 3 men slept in the house, but only 2 slept deeply. Thomas sat by the fire again, rifle across his lap. Jude lay on the couch, slingshot tucked under his arm like a talisman. Rafe took the floor, curled near the stove, one boot off, hat over his face. The dog didn't bark that night, but it whined low once just before sunrise. The next morning, Rafe rode out. Said nothing more than a nod. No promises, just silence and the dust of his horse's hooves trailing east. Thomas and Jude watched him disappear. Then they got back to work. They dug a trench near the barn, filled it with dry brush, coated it in oil. A last line of fire if it came to that. They mounted lanterns on the porch. Prepared the horses with saddles just in case. And then, with everything else done, Thomas pulled out the second rifle from the back room. Caleb's, still polished, still clean. He handed it to Jude. You sure? The boy asked. You're ready. Jude held it close, not with excitement, but with understanding. That night the torches returned. Not 5-4. Closer this time. Thomas stood on the porch, rifle in hand, Jude behind him. They want us to come to them, the boy said. We won't. But one of the men stepped forward. It wasn't the uncle, a different man, broad scar on his cheek, hat low. I'm giving you 1 night, the man shouted. By sunup we come through, you give him up or we take him, burn this place to ash. Thomas raised his rifle, didn't speak. The man grinned, sunup. They turned and rode back toward the ridge. Thomas went inside, bolted the door. Jude followed. We should run, the boy said. We can't fight all of them. No, Thomas said, we don't run anymore. They sat together by the fire again. Jude cleaned his rifle. Thomas oiled the hinges on the trapdoor. When the flame flickered low, Jude looked up. Do you think God brought me here? Thomas stared into the coals. I think God's the only one who could have. Jude nodded, closed his eyes. Thomas watched him a while, then reached over and laid a hand on his shoulder. You're not alone anymore. That's all that matters. Outside, the wind began to howl. Inside, the fire held steady. And in a house once ruled by silence, 2 hearts beat as one. They rose before the sun. The stars still hung above the valley, quiet and pale, fading by the minute as the eastern horizon bruised with the first hints of light. The frost had returned overnight, coating the porch rails, the fence posts, the dried weeds with a silvery skin. Thomas moved through it like a man walking through a memory, slow, precise, carrying the full weight of everything that had happened and everything that might happen next. Jude was already dressed, Caleb's rifle strapped across his chest. He hadn't slept more than a few hours, but there was no exhaustion in him now, just a cold, steady purpose. He stood near the kitchen table where Thomas had laid out what little ammunition they had left, a small stack of cartridges, 6 shotgun shells, and 2 bullets for the long rifle. Not enough for a fight, but maybe enough for a message. They ate bread and bacon in silence. No coffee, no idle talk, the kind of meal a man eats when he knows it might be his last. When they finished, Thomas handed Jude a strip of cloth, dark, clean, cut from one of Mary's old dresses, and tied one around his own arm. "So we know each other in the smoke," he said simply. Jude nodded. By the time the sky had turned gray, they were in position. Thomas crouched near the barn, rifle resting on the hay bale, eyes scanning the trail from the ridge. He'd taken the high ground, the spot with the best view and the worst cover. Jude was tucked in behind the water trough across the yard, his smaller frame nearly invisible behind the warped boards and tall grass. They'd gone over signals. 1 whistle for danger, 2 for regroup, 3 for run, but both of them knew there might not be time for signals. Thomas had seen war, real war, not saloon brawls and drunken duels. He'd marched under a different sun, fired into shadows that looked like men, and buried friends with his own 2 hands. But this felt different, more personal, more final, because this time the boy at his side wasn't just a casualty he was trying to prevent, he was a reason to keep going. And then they came. 3 riders, 1 wagon. No torches this time, just steel and sweat and dust. The wagon was covered with a tarp, something underneath it, wooden crates, maybe a keg. 2 men flanked it on horseback, rifles strapped across their backs. The 3rd man rode ahead. The uncle. Shoulder bandaged, face grim, mouth curled in a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. Thomas raised the scope, watched them close the distance. He waited. And just as the horses stepped onto the main path near the pasture gate, he fired. The shot cracked like thunder, splitting the morning in 2. It hit the post beside the uncle's horse, just enough to spook the animal and send the man crashing to the dirt. Thomas didn't aim to kill, not yet. This was a warning. The horses reared, the men shouted, the wagon jerked to a halt. Jude held position, steady, watching, breathing through his mouth to keep it quiet. The uncle stood, brushing dirt off his coat. He looked up toward the barn, hands outstretched. "Didn't think you'd shoot first, Avery. You didn't think I'd shoot at all. Should have known better. You always were the stubborn kind." Thomas shifted his stance, keeping one eye on the men near the wagon. "You've had your warnings," he called. "You come any closer, you leave in boxes." "Don't need to come closer," the uncle shouted back. "We brought something with us, thought you might want to see." He turned toward the wagon and yanked back the tarp. Inside were barrels, stamped in black ink, kerosene. Jude's breath caught. Thomas tightened his grip. "You think you can scare us off with fire?" he shouted. "Not scare," the uncle said. "Just level the field. You've built a nice little fortress. Be a shame if it all went up before you even got a shot off." One of the riders pulled a bottle from his saddlebag, glass, with a rag stuffed in the neck. "A Molotov." Jude shifted behind the trough. Thomas raised his rifle again. "You light that and you don't get a second chance." The uncle smirked. "I only need one." And with that, he nodded to the man on the left. The bottle ignited. But Thomas was faster. The second shot rang out, hitting the bottle mid-arc, shattering it in the air. Flames burst outward and fell harmlessly into the mud, sputtering out. The men cursed, the horses reared again. Thomas chambered the 3rd round, his last. The uncle's voice dropped the pretense. "You got no more bullets, old man." "I've got enough," Thomas said, even as he handed Jude the final round from his coat pocket. "Make it count." Jude nodded, loaded the chamber and steadied his aim. But before he could fire, the wagon exploded. Not from gunfire, from within. A plume of smoke erupted as the second barrel ignited. Something had sparked. Maybe a faulty seal, maybe heat trapped beneath the tarp. Flames shot skyward, engulfing the wagon. The men screamed, horses tore free, and chaos erupted in the yard. Thomas dove from the hay bale as fire licked the barn's edge. Jude sprang from cover, dodging splinters as one of the crates blew apart, sending shards into the fence. The uncle staggered, half his coat aflame, and fell to his knees, shouting for help. But no help came. The two other men had fled, disappearing into the trees. Thomas sprinted across the yard, rifle swinging behind him, and grabbed the water bucket from the trough. He doused the flames, licking up the barn wall, then kicked dirt over the embers. Jude stood frozen near the fence, face pale. Thomas ran to him, grabbed his shoulders. "You hurt?" Jude shook his head. "No, just scared." "Good, that means you're still thinking." Smoke rose behind them. The wagon burned hot and high, sending black trails into the morning sky. The uncle didn't move. Thomas approached him slowly. The man was still breathing, but his coat was scorched, one hand blistered red. His eyes fluttered open. "You gonna shoot me?" he rasped. "No." "Why not?" "Because death's easy," Thomas said. "Living with what you did, that's harder." The uncle tried to speak again, but coughed instead. Blood stained his lips. Thomas stood, looked down at him. "Law is still alive in this county," he said. "You'll answer to it." He turned to Jude. "Ride to Cold Hollow. Bring Pastor Emmett and the marshal." Jude nodded and ran for the horse. Thomas watched him go, watched the boy he'd found starving by the fence become something stronger than he ever imagined, watched him ride with purpose, with courage, not away from the danger but toward justice. The fire smoldered, but it didn't spread. The barn was singed, but it stood. And for the first time in years, Thomas Avery felt something crack open in his chest, not pain, not grief. Something like hope. It took 2 hours for the marshal to arrive, followed by Emmett and Henry Pike. They took the uncle into custody, bandaged and silent. He didn't speak again. Not that day. Not the next. When asked about his motives, he just stared at the wall. Pastor Emmett pulled Thomas aside. "You should press charges." "I will." Attempted arson, assault, attempted kidnapping. "I know." Emmett glanced toward Jude, who was helping Henry haul the burnt wreckage away from the pasture. "He's tougher than he looks. He's tougher than most." That evening the ranch sat quiet. The fire was rebuilt, the house aired out, the shutters closed tight. Jude sat on the porch with a glass of cider, staring at the stars. Thomas joined him. "Think they'll come back?" Jude asked. "Not if they've got any sense left." "And if they do?" Thomas looked at the boy beside him, the one who had once clung to the fence like a ghost, who now sat tall and still, a survivor forged in fire. "Then we stand," he said, "same as before." They sat in silence. The stars blinked overhead, the wind eased. And in that stillness, the world seemed to settle. Jude leaned back in the chair. "You ever think about building something new, not just surviving but growing?" Thomas nodded slowly. "I do now." There were nights when Jude woke crying, the tail end of a nightmare still flickering behind his eyes. He never called out, but Thomas heard him anyway. Each time he'd walk to the boy's room, sit at the edge of the bed and rest a hand on his shoulder. Neither would speak. They didn't need to. And sometimes it was Thomas who sat outside long after dark, staring at the stars, remembering the son he'd buried. Not comparing, just honoring. Grief had become a companion, not one he welcomed, but one he understood. One evening, as they sat around the small table playing a quiet game of checkers, Jude asked, "Do you think people can come back?" Thomas looked up. "What do you mean?" "Not from the dead, but from being broken, from being lost. Do you think someone like my uncle, if he hadn't been so cruel, if someone had reached him earlier, do you think he could have changed? Thomas moved a piece. I don't know. Some men rot from the inside, and by the time you see it, the damage is already done. Others just get lost in the dark and don't know how to ask for light. Jude nodded slowly. You ever been lost? Thomas smiled without joy. More times than I'll admit. What brought you back? He looked across the table. A boy with dirt on his face and bones poking through his coat, standing at my fence. Jude swallowed hard. I'm glad you opened the door. I am too. They didn't finish the game that night. They just sat there, content in the space between words. Then came the letter. I think I want to start a journal, Jude said suddenly. A journal? Yeah, so I don't forget all this. So I remember who I was before and who I'm becoming. Thomas nodded. That's a good idea. I'll write about you too, Jude added. You're part of it. I'd be honored. They rode the rest of the way in silence. That night Jude stayed up late, writing by lamplight. Thomas passed by his door once, paused and looked in. The boy sat at the desk, brow furrowed, pen moving steadily across the page. The sight filled Thomas with something deep and unspoken. Not pride, not relief, something older than both, like watching the sunrise over land you nearly lost. The next morning, they began rebuilding the north fence. Not because it was broken, but because it could be stronger. Together they measured, cut, hammered. And as the sun rose over the hill, Thomas looked at Jude, sweat on his brow, eyes bright, hands steady. A boy who had once been a stranger at his fence, now a son who had carved a place into the very bones of the land. And Thomas knew then, beyond doubt, that some stories aren't about what you've lost. They're about what you choose to keep.